Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Elemental has gotten so many changes since last we looked at it. So many changes that it got changed back to what it is on live. Maelstrom is back as a resource. Conduits and Legendaries come about to offer some interesting builds, so let's check it out. If you haven't heard yet, we are running a giveaway for beta invites on Shadowlands, of course, and we published a video about it that you should check. You only have until the 14th of September, at which point we will announce the winners on our stream at twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline, which you should also check anyway, because we be doing dungeons and raids on both live and beta. So, see you there. With that out of the way, let's talk changes. I mentioned we have a video on Elemental already that you can check. Right now, Searing Totem is gone because it didn't really have a cool interaction with the spec. I honestly think it could have been a great mini cooldown to have if it, I don't know, extended active flame shocks by 1 second every time you shot a target. But alas, it wasn't made to be. Maelstrom is back as a resource to replace Fulmination. People have different opinions about this, although at the end of the day, the devs were right. Fulmination became a buff you had to keep track that enabled you to buff Earth Shocks and Earthquakes and encouraged you to only cast them while consuming Fulmination. Hence, you would only cast them after you sank a bunch of Fulmination generators into your enemies, aka Maelstrom generators now. The difference is in the outcome. You would have tracked a buff on your UI instead of a resource bar, which is more straightforward and easy to observe. Fundamentally, you lost some flexibility and a bit of artificial death, but that's a talk for another time. Flame Tongue weapon is still doing nothing unless you want to melee your target and deal less than 1% of a lava burst damage as extra fire damage on your melee attacks. Come on, give us a bit of spell power or, I don't know, an interaction with Flame Shock. If the devs really want us to push Primal Strike into your rotation, make it extend Flame Shock's duration if you hit a target with Primal Strike and Flame Tongue imbued as well. It's not enough to force you to walk in melee and start going ham, but it might be enough where you will outright not lose DPS if you hit with Primal Strike. Maybe it can even extend Frost Shock slow so you can have some PvP interactions. Anything except a vanilla tooltip for very low damage. Even though we talked about it in the last Elemental video, Spirit Walker's Grace being back is amazing. Although Elemental has a fair bit of instant cast spells and procs outside of Ghost Wolf, it's still immobile. And in Ghost Wolf you can't do your rotation anyway. Spirit Walker's Grace helps with stuff like that, and you know, the last boss of Necrotic Wave, for instance, where the mechanic forces you to continuously move for a few seconds. That is an incredibly detrimental mechanic for a ranged DPS and handled very well by Spirit Walker's Grace. Although the Covenant abilities for the Shaman haven't changed outside tuning, I was able to test them all out a bit more this time. The Vesper Totem from the Kyrian still feels the best one so far. You put a totem down and the next 5 damaging spells trigger it to launch an AoE wave of damage for each one of those 5 spells. Same thing with the healing, and to make it reliable you can reposition it so the appropriate targets will be affected. The playstyle is nice, it doesn't alter your DPS rotation too much. It can compel you to heal since the healing it does is actually quite good. Primordial Wave could be the next best thing, if not better than Vesper Totem. The Necrolord's class ability lets you shoot out a wave of shadow damage that applies a flame shock to the target, then buffs your next lava burst to hit all targets with Flame Shock on them. This is mostly an AoE ability. It still works in single target where your one target will get hit by 2 lava bursts from what I've been able to test so far. The Night Fae of Arden will come with another hybrid ability. Fey Transfusion has gotten a lot of flack, but whenever I play with it, it deals a gazillion damage in AoE. Not to mention that when you pop it afterwards for the heal is beefy. In this sense, it's a little less global intensive as Vesper if you want to heal your allies at least. It also has no interactions with your spec, and if anything, it breaks you from it. Maybe if we see it generate a little bit of Maelstrom, either directly or indirectly, then maybe it won't feel so disconnected. Lastly, Chain Harvest has been buffed a bit in terms of its numbers. It now deals 3 times as much damage as Lava Burst per target, so multiply that by 5, at least with the current scaling, and heals as much as a Chain Heal, it seems, but obviously with no subsequent target penalty, also hitting up to 5 targets. Anytime it crits, its cooldown gets reduced by 5 seconds. Elemental wouldn't be the first time it would be a crit-focused spec, and that can work really well with this one. If it crits enough, it might even align with Stormkeeper for consistent 1-minute bursts of damage, and healing as well. This kind of rounds up the abilities for Elemental, and it's clear their focus is strictly in a hybrid direction, which is not bad for a class like Shaman, and actually I felt like I could take care of and help my party a bit more than in BFA. The talents have actually changed a bit here and there. On the first row you have a new talent called Static Discharge. This one makes your lightning shield discharge electrical zaps at targets, preferably ones with flame shock on them, every 0.5 seconds for a total of 3 seconds, so 6 sticks. It is dog shit. This doesn't do anything outside damage, and the damage is incredibly low. It doesn't even zap in AoE if you have multiple flame shocks up. It's only single target. It doesn't even generate Maelstrom. You will be having a very difficult time justifying this over Echo of the Elements and even Earthen Rage. On the second row, Aftershock remains the same. Echoing Shock in the same place we saw it last, although not sure if I did mention it last time. It duplicates the next spell, and it seems that an empowered lightning bolt with Stormkeeper also gets duplicated with the overload procs, unless I was just lucky to have overload proc the same for the copied spell as well. Either way, this could become the default if not for Elemental Blast that replaced Totem Mastery. For all specs now, this will no longer offer flat numeric buffs to your secondary stats, but percentages instead. For Elemental though, I really don't like the current iteration of Elemental Blast consuming Maelstrom. You can fit in 1 Earth Shock and maybe a second with the current starter gear during its window. It can be good late game in creating some consistent pressure, but with a 12-second cooldown and a 10-second duration, it feels like the game is forcing you to have it at a high uptime while sacking half of an Earth Shock. Maybe it can be good in AoE, but unless you can speed up your Maelstrom generation through sheer haste, it will feel clunky. It does for me. The rest of the talent tree is more or less the same, so let's check out the Legendaries! Shaman has maybe some of the coolest legendaries. In this video we will check the elemental specific ones, but be warned, there are a lot more generic options to get. Skybreaker's Fiery Demise is an interesting one, coming back from the tier 24-piece bonus. It boosts the Flame Shock's crit chance by 30%, and every time the tick's crit, Fire Elemental cooldown is reduced by 1 second. This in AoE can be pretty cool, and even in single target where Storm Ellie with Primal Elementalist has been a staple build for years, can net some interesting results. Not to mention that during the Elemental uptime, where it already buffs Flame Shocks, you are just stronger altogether. You can move from an Elemental cooldown-centric playstyle to a more Elementalist approach. Elemental Equilibrium will make each elemental type buff another. Fire damage will buff your next Frost spell by 30%. Frost damage increases your next Nature damage by 25%, and Nature will buff the next Fire spell by 20%. I haven't done The Sims, and I am sure some big brain Earth Shrine admin is working on it already, but I can see see this working with Ice Fury. This can create one of the most complex rotations if the damage is worth it, where you play around it 100% of the time. It will be restrictive, but you will increase your overall output by quite a bit. Like, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this turned the rotation into a rock, paper, scissors mechanic where you play the buff with each global. Right now you will hit walls where you need a nature spell for the buff, but have 2 charges of lava burst if you play Echo. Maybe this can work with Earthen Rage better, or simply pick up Elemental Blast, which should eat any of the buffs. Echoes of the Great Sundering makes your Earth Shock or Elemental Blast buff your next Earthquake damage by 250%. This is a bit awkward, especially if you don't play Elemental Blast. It actually deals almost double the damage of an Earth Shock in single target, so although it's clearly meant for AoE, it's very likely this could eat up a slot in your single target rotation, not to mention in AoE you might be forced to cast Earth Shock. Or Elemental Blast, which is probably better. I mean, people have different opinions about AoE abilities dealing more damage in single target than single target abilities have but you kinda have to work your butt off at the beginning, since the window in which you can cast the Empowered Earthquake is fairly short, since Earthshock eats a bit of Maelstrom anyway, and you might have to pull a bit before Earthshocking so you can have some wiggle room when it comes to getting that Quake out ASAP. Cool Lego though. Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence would be the single target version of the last one. This time, Earthshock or Elemental Blast will empower Lava Burst to deal 30% more damage. Now, the tooltip says your next Lava Burst, which would be kinda underwhelming. Luckily, the game actually knows of our struggles, and instead, when you Earthshock, you get a 14 or 15 second buff, during which time all meatballs will deal 30% more damage. And boy, do they chunk! This can be a good legendary if the tooltip is wrong and can see some elementals get some single target love, since fundamentally, without multi-targets to funnel some flame shock damage and procs, the spec will never operate at its full capacity in pure single target scenarios. If the Covenant you chose did not satisfy your need for further depth of class and spec, Soulbinds and Conduits will. Soulbinds are essentially secondary talent trees with traits that can buff you in certain ways. You cannot have all traits at the same time, and choosing the path to go down by can unlock specific conduits, which will essentially act as talents you never got for 3 expansions. But it's okay, we are not mad or sad or sit on a lily pad to contemplate the devs that didn't add new stuff to the plate. No new trait or weight to the spec, which is in a poor state, like my last blind date. Yeah. For Kyrians, an interesting soulbind can be Clea, which is a more supporty/utility type option here. Valiant Strikes transforms crits into heals on your group, and seeing as how crit could still be yet again your main stat, this will net some very welcome results. And if you are willing to sacrifice 1 potency conduit, you can get pointed courage to go along with it. Crit Banzai! Going with the crit theme to Maldraxxus, you have the Bonesmith with his Marrowed Gemstone trait, which is probably the best crit trait from all of the Soulbinds so far, that I have seen anyway. 20% extra crit chance for 20 seconds once per minute is crazy! Couple it with the Flame Shock crit legendary and the Primordial Wave ability you'll get anyway, and your needs will be met. I think. The Night Phase seem to have more overall support Soulbinds, yet Khorane has First Strike, where you get a 10% crit chance for 10 seconds if you attack a target before it gets to attack you, which, as a ranged DPS, it should not be a problem. You would sacrifice 1 potency conduits, but gain 2 endurance conduits. This can give you more overall tankiness. Lastly, for the Venthyr, Nadia comes to fully, hopefully, solve some of the boss damage issues that you are known to be weak at. Dauntless Duelist will give you overall 4% more damage on the first target you engage in combat until the target dies, and you take 2% less damage from them. You would sacrifice 1 potency conduit for it, but in the end you will also get Thrill Seeker that gives you 20% haste ever so often while in combat. If crit is your number one go-to, haste can easily be a close second, at least that in value. Although between the 20% haste here and 30% from your bloodlust, you might even get away with not taking that much haste to begin with. I mentioned conduits a fair bit. Conduits are socketed traits you will put in your Soulbind path to get their bonuses. You have endurance conduits that buff stuff like reincarnation, earth elemental, and stuff like that. Finesse would be the utility ones, Tremor Totem cooldown reduction, Ghost Wolf speed increase. Buffs like those are what you can expect. Potency though, now these are the real power gains for your spec. Call of Flame will make your elemental last 15% longer, all the way to 30% at rank 15. We already talked about the fire elemental build, so yeah, this has synergies already with the legendaries and talents, and I love me some fire elemental. Earth and Sky has an old tooltip soon to be adjusted for Maelstrom or redesigned completely. The base effect is for Earth Shock and Elemental Blast to deal more damage based on their resource consumption, but Maelstrom is static. Chances are we will see a similar effect that will buff single target output, at least we can only hope. For a more Lightning Bolt approach, High Voltage will give Lightning Bolt a 30% chance to generate double the amount of Maelstrom. Passively, this is good enough if you don't play stuff like Ice Fury that will naturally reduce the amount of Lightning Bolts you shoot out. Could work even better with the Storm Elemental talent and the Elemental build we saw several times already. Lastly, Shake the Foundations will give Earthquake a 15% chance per cast to instantly launch a chain lightning at a random enemy. This has clear usage for dungeons and AoE, but the proc chance is incredibly low to be efficient and consistent, at least at the first level of gear. You won't dish out as many quakes as you would like, maybe 2 per pack. It will scale better with higher ranks and tougher content though. Still, a measly chain lightning on a % chance per cast, so not per tick of damage, is still underwhelming. Maybe changes so it will be per damage tick. Now, that would be a conduit. Love it or hate it, being back to Maelstrom makes Elemental play similar to BFA. It was inevitable to reach this point looking at how Fulmination was changed to make sense. Turns out Maelstrom is still a better mechanic. Is it the best? Probably not, but even so, I always thought that mechanically, Elemental is one of the very few casters that are designed decently. The problem was, and still is on the beta, output. It looks, feels and sounds fantastic as a spec, but the numbers are mediocre at best. Tuning is upon us and definitely on the horizon. Most likely can happen shortly after we release this video, since we playtest sometime before we end up publishing it. As such, we still strongly recommend keeping in touch with the Shaman Community Earth Shrine on Discord. Big theory crafters discuss and debate there regularly, and anything that we missed or were off on, you can find there. And once again, a quick reminder for our giveaway, make sure to check our video and follow the instructions, because you'll only be able to do this until the 14th of September. And we want your butts in the beta so we can play some dungeons, maybe even raids. And of course, thank you to our patrons for supporting our content and everything that we do. We finally got in touch with Blizzard, and that's an awesome feeling, and we wouldn't have reached this point without you. And dear viewer, if you like our content and you want to support us a little bit more, check the link down below to our Patreon page, our merch page, and everything that you could need. Thank you very much for watching the video. Stay awesome, and we'll see you next time.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.